What people don't realize about the Zulosoi is that the Zulosoi is the strangest thing that God ever made. And what did he do? I mean, according to what people have said, that the Ramchal and so on and so forth, the Zulosai was created with a certain sense of self-awareness. And God wanted to give it a tov. God wanted to be made there with the Zulosai. Okay. And therefore he wanted to give him a chelik in Olam Haba. Why? So we're really not clear on that. But God wanted him to earn that chelik in Olam Haba. And that's fundamentally what he did. But is that really what went on? Is that really the essence of what's going on with God and the Zulosai? That he wanted to create another being so who can enjoy coexistence with God, and he wanted to do this for this being called the Zulosai. But is that exactly really what happened? And what I basically say, that's not really what's going on. And because we think that the Zulosai is like any other being, he's an extraordinary creation man, and an extraordinary being, and God wants to give that being tov. He wanted to give it a very great tov, which is to coexist with God. But when you really look at the Zulosai and you look at its properties, you see that it's something which was never created before. And what is that? For example, you see that compare the Zulosai to a malach, and you say that a malach also has self-awareness in a certain sense. But there's a difference between the self-awareness of an angel and the self-awareness of man. And this tells you something about what man is. When you look at the self-awareness of an angel, what is that? An angel fundamentally has a certain mission. It has a mission in that the angel represents the executive power of the spheres, or the anogas, the attributes of God. And a malach is really an executing agent for the spheres, for these hanogas. So the midas of chesed, din, and rachamim are fundamentally performed by angels. So therefore an angel is really an agent who has a mission, and the mission that it has comes from the spheres. What type of mission it possesses comes from the spheres that it represents. If it represents the midah of din, so its mission has to do with justice. If it represents the midah of rachamim, its mission has to do with compassion. But fundamentally, a malach really is nothing more than its mission. And this is exactly how it's to be understood. In fact, the name of a malach is his mission. That's his real name. And if you know the real name of a malach, the real name, you can actually control it in terms of its mission and influence what it does. When you look at the Zulosai, you see that it also has self-awareness. But its self-awareness is not about a mission. What is it about? It's simply about being aware of oneself, knowing that you are, knowing that you exist. It's simply a possession of self where you have the knowledge that you exist. That's it. It's a pure self which gives you that knowledge. That knowledge is not composed of a mission, something that you have to do, or so on and so forth. So therefore, what exactly is the self-awareness of the Zulosai? We see that the self-awareness of a malach has to do with its mission. And the self-awareness of a person is pure. It's simply an act of self-awareness. Well, what exactly is that? That's because the Zulosoi, in its act of self-awareness, is pure. It has a factor of self-awareness that's simply self-awareness. Its fundamental function is to know that it is. Is to know that it exists. Now, there's only one thing that's somewhat similar to the Zulosoi, where it has a self-awareness unto itself that allows it to know that it is. And what is that? Well, technically speaking, that's God. Does God know that he is? Does he have a knowledge of himself? Of course. So the possession of self-awareness in its pure form as a self is something which pertains to God. So when God created the Zulosoi, he created a being who was most similar to him. That's right. It's most similar to the self-awareness of God. In fact, God did not actually create the Zulosoi. He did not create it. He derived it. He derived it from himself. How he did this, we don't know. But fundamentally, he derived the aspect of self-awareness from his own self-awareness. So therefore we see that a person is totally different than everything else which God created in the universe. In the spiritual universe, in terms of what? Hanogas, in terms of Malachim, and in the physical universe, in terms of animals and plants and so on. There is nothing like man who has a sense of his own being and his own existence. That's why man is called a Tselem Elokim, a mirror image of God. So in other words, man is the closest thing that resembles God. That means that what God created, or I should say God derived, when he derived man, was a figure which is most similar to him. And that means that man is derived, is in the form of a divine being. In other words, mankind has a certain divinity in the sense that mankind resembles God. It's called the Tselem Elokim, or the mirror image of God. So what God actually created, what God, I should say, derived, when he derived the human being, is that he derived something which is most similar to him. And what exactly is that, most similar to him? What is the one fundamental quality which is true of God himself? If I ask you the question, what is the quality that's most true of God? Well, the quality that's most true of him is the concept of independence. In other words, God is absolutely independent of every force, everything that can exist. Why do we say that? Because when we say Eino Movado, there's nothing but God, what we really mean to say in its deeper sense, it's not simply that there's one God or there can be no other God. That's one concept that we say, but that's not the real concept. The real concept of Eino Movado, there is no one else, is the concept that there is no outside. God has no outside. And you have to understand what that means. From a structural standpoint, everything which exists, every entity which exists in the spiritual and in the physical universe exists from a structure of an inside and an outside. So that that object has a certain structure and a certain substance. And the substance of the thing, of the entity, is the entity. And we call that the inside of the entity. At the same time, as the subject has a certain being from its substance, it has something which is not of its substance, and we call that its outside. So therefore, everything which created has a boundary between the inside and the outside. God himself has no boundary at all, because God has no outside. There is nothing outside of God. And since there is nothing outside of him, his power is absolute. He's the only one in control of everything, simply because there is no outside. So when we say that man is created in the image of God, when we say that man is a tselem Elokim, we're saying that in a certain sense, in a certain way, this is true of man. That he also, to some extent, has no outside. And the question is, what does this really mean, that man also has no outside? Well, what it means is that man has the ability to create something which never existed before, and which he is fundamentally totally responsible. So if a person is responsible for something and that never existed before, then in a certain way, man also has no outside. Because whatever it is that he created comes entirely from him, himself. It doesn't come from anything outside of man. And what is that? What is it that man can create that comes entirely from him? And the answer is, he has free will. Because what does free will mean? Free will means, in regard to a specific action or a specific creation, it does not come from anywhere except through him. And when we say that something comes through the efforts of mankind, it means it comes from him, from nothing else. So therefore, it's from man's inside, not from his outside. So with respect to anything that man is free, he has no outside. He creates the item which comes from him. So in that regard, mankind, therefore, is similar to God, in the sense that in a certain capacity, mankind also has no outside. Anything in reference to his free will means that it's something which comes from him entirely. And this is a very deep concept, which means that when God derived man from himself, he actually derived a being which is closest as possible to himself. It's almost like a mirror image of himself. And that's why man is called a zulosoi. That's why man is called an other, an outside. Why is man called an other outside of God? Because in a certain sense, man himself has no outside with respect to the domain where he is completely free as in the respect that mankind has free will, he has no outside either. And this is an extraordinary thing. The truth is, most people have no idea of the true nature of man. That man's free will puts him above and beyond everything possible. Because nothing is outside God. You see? And nothing itself has no outside. That's not possible. But with man we say that in a certain sense, man has no outside, that his will comes from him and him alone. So in that regard, he has a slight quality of independence similar to God. Free will gives the property of independence to someone where he does not rely on anything outside of him. So for all practical purposes, he has no outside. So in that regard, therefore, mankind has what is divine. That's right. He is the closest thing that God made to himself, to something which has no outside. In other words, what he creates is from his inside. It doesn't come at all from an outside. So when we say man is free, it means in a certain sense, man is even free of God. So we have to analyze that. Mankind didn't simply create a being so that he can give that being tov or goodness. That's not simply the reason. When God created, or I should say derived, when he derived the species called man, he derived something which is the closest possible to himself. And in what capacity is this? It's the capacity of free will. And only man can have free will. Nothing can have free will. Because to be totally free of everything so that you have free will means that in a certain sense you replicate the divine quality of Einoi Movadoi. He has no outside. Now, why did God do this? Why did God create such a being? Why did he create a being who fundamentally, to some extent, does not possess an outside similar to God? And that's a critical question. And the answer to that is a strange concept. And I'd like to discuss this concept. You know, many years ago, I thought of this idea, and I don't know why I thought of it, but it's a very strange idea. If you were giving God an interview, what would you ask God fundamentally? What would you say to God fundamentally if you wanted to give him an interview? Well, I thought that you'd probably say to God, how does it feel like to be God? In other words, we know what God is, that he has no outside. So what does that feel like? What does that feel like to you when you are that being? That's a strange question, of course. Nobody would think of asking God, how does it feel to be God? That's really strange. But I was wondering, if you asked that of God, what would God say? So what God would say, I feel very happy. I do. Why do I feel happy? Why does God answer with the concept that I would have tremendous pleasure from being God? Why? So the question is, where does pleasure come from? Most pleasure comes to a person from his sensory organs. In other words, we have pleasure from what we see. When we're looking at a beautiful painting, we take pleasure. We have pleasure also from what we hear, like we have pleasure when we listen to music. We have pleasure from what we taste. We have pleasure from what we touch. So fundamentally, pleasure comes to us from our sensory organs. But there's another form of pleasure that a person can have. He has another form of pleasure where he has pleasure from his achievements. That's right. When you accomplish something critical, You see it? And you create something which really didn't exist before. That gives you a certain amount of satisfaction or very deep sense of pleasure. So pleasure can not only come from a sensory stimulus, but pleasure can also come from what you achieve, what you accomplish. But there's a third type of pleasure, which nothing really possesses except God. And that pleasure does not come from a sensory organ, because God has no sensory organs. It does not come from an achievement, because God really, we don't know how he does things, because since he has no outside, he does not do anything new. So it's very hard to understand exactly how God acts. God does not act like we act, where we go from the past to the present and the future. We don't initiate an action, because since God has no outside, he is the sum total of everything that is, that was, and that will be. So there's no real action that he does. But what God says is something else. I have pleasure not from something that I do or something that I receive. No. I simply have pleasure from my being, from who I am. Why? Because since I have no outside, I do not need anything to exist. My existence does not come from outside of me. It is identical to me. It is synonymous with who I am. That's why my name is the Shem Havaya, or the word means, the Shem Havaya, which is the four-letter name of God, means to exist. In other words, I am my existence. So in a certain sense, you can call me Mr. Existence. I don't possess existence. Existence is not given to me by anything else. I am it. So since I am existence, I am the cause of myself. Of course, it's very difficult to understand how you can be the cause of yourself. But it's not that God is the cause of himself. God is existence. And so he is existence itself. We cannot comprehend this. But when you are your own existence, that is your identity. So there's a certain pleasure, there's a certain supreme pleasure that comes to that being. Because that being is absolutely independent of everything. And so there's an aspect of happiness or satisfaction that's endemic to that type of being. That type of being needs nothing else to exist. We cannot even comprehend such a thing. But the fact is like this. When God created man, when he derived man, I should say, and he wanted to give him a certain pleasure, what pleasure did he want to give him? Well, that's called Olam Haba. That's the place where we will experience that pleasure. And that pleasure is called Tov, or it's called tremendous benefit. And what is that pleasure? Well, that's not the pleasure of a sensory organ. That's not even the pleasure of achievement. Although the Ramchal seems to imply that achievement is necessary, because man has to earn Olam Haba. How does he earn it? By achievement, by doing something which is unique. But that's not true. What I believe, man has the pleasure of his own being, because in a certain sense, he resembles God. How? Because he has free will. In other words, he has no outside. He can actually make something from his inner being that never existed before. So in a certain sense, he can create something which is at its core, is himself. He Man is the only being that simply is, that simply doesn't exist, but he can create his own existence. That's right. That's what free will means. Free will means that you can make yourself. In some sense, you are your own cause. And there's nothing in creation, nothing in existence that can do that. Why do I say that man can do it? Because man has free will. That means when he decides to do something, it comes from himself. And we say it comes from the inner core of man. And that's an actual creation of some sort. And it does not come from an outside. So therefore, man is capable of deriving a satisfaction or for a pleasure which is similar to God. Of course, it's not equal to God in any sense, because God is totally himself with no outside at all. But to some extent, man is similar because he has free will. So he can create his essence in actuality, and he can derive the pleasure from that creation. So therefore, God wanted to create man as a divine being, somewhat similar to him, so that he can create something which is inside of him, not outside of him. That's right. You see, we don't really comprehend, but that's what's told. That is Olam Haba. Olam Haba is simply the creation by a person of himself, of his will, to a decision, which never existed outside of him, and only comes from himself. It comes from the itself, his inner core, and that inner core is made when he makes that decision. And that's the concept of why God made man in the first place. God wanted to create man as a divine being, or I should say, as a quasi-divine being. And what is the essence of divinity? The essence of divinity is that you have no outside. Everything that you have is what you are. So when God gave man free will, and he made him in his image, in a certain sense, he gave man the ability to actually create something from scratch, create something from nothing. In other words, from his inner core, where he does not have an outside. So therefore, the reason why man is somewhat divine is because God wanted to create a quasi-divine being who can derive pleasure from his being, from his core, that totally comes from himself. We cannot comprehend this. This is stupendous. We cannot comprehend this. What does it mean that you derive your pleasure, you derive your satisfaction or your happiness from yourself, completely, from your core? What? It means that you are actually creating yourself, and that's what Olam Haba. The ultimate satisfaction of Olam Haba is somewhat similar to God, because it comes from your inner being. The satisfaction of Tov that you get by existing comes from you, not outside of you. So in that sense, you're similar to God. It's a very deep concept. That's why God created a being who was somewhat similar to him. What's called a Dimul Elokim, or a replicated Ein Sof. Why did he want to do this? Because he wanted mankind to have a similar kind of pleasure that he possesses. A pleasure that comes from his being. Doesn't come from the outside, doesn't come from a sensory organ, doesn't come from his achievements. It comes from himself. And the total achievement which he possesses is the creation of himself. That is what is Olam Haba. It's nothing more than what? Than a situation where you have created yourself. And therefore, in a certain way, you somewhat share this aspect of God. That he has his simcha, his joy comes from who he is, not what he does. It has nothing to do with his achievements. It has nothing to do with an outside possibility. It comes from the execution of his free will to create something himself, his inner core, which never existed before. And that's why God made man so high to be a quasi-divine entity. I hope I'm explaining this well enough. So the derivation of man from God is an exercise in making something which is somewhat similar to the divine being. And by creating something similar to the divine being, God wanted to create a source of pleasure that comes from your inner being, does not come from the outside at all. So in that way, Olam Haba is somewhat similar to the world of God, whatever that is. You see it? The world of God is where he is, and he is all over because there's nothing outside of him. But in giving man an Olam Haba, God gave man, in a certain sense, a world similar to his, where satisfaction comes from your inner being. So that's the answer to the question, why does man have to do something? Because that's why God wants man to exercise his free will. In other words, what is the one action that a person has to do? He has to do something. He has to make a choice in his free will. And when he makes a choice, only he makes that choice. That choice does not come from anywhere else. So therefore, it's like a divine action. A divine action, which is an action which comes from free will. That's the definition of a divine action. It comes from free will. What does that mean, free will? It doesn't come from any outside. There is no force outside which guides you or impresses you to do something. Where does it come from? It comes from the inner you, what you are. And in a certain sense, that quality that you are is yourself. It's not an outside. That's why God wanted to create man similar to him, so that he can have the same type of joy that he has. Of course, to a much larger degree, a completely different degree. But he wanted to give man the ability to share his type of joy. Well, where does it come from? It comes from the exercise of your free will, which means the exercise of your being that has no outside. I hope I'm being clear. That's why God created man as a kind of a divine being. And that's why he said to man, I want you to do certain actions. I want you to do certain mitzvahs. I want you to declare your relationship with me by doing certain mitzvahs. And what are these mitzvahs? These are actions that come from free will. Everything in the existence has actions that do not come from free will. Nothing has free will in all existence. Only man has that. Because only man could do something where the origin or the source of that action is himself. It's not outside of him. And in that sense, he possesses a similar characteristic of God. That's why man is divine in a certain sense. He has a certain divinity, so that he can share the same type of joy that God shares, a joy which comes from himself. What is the action that man can do from its free will? So the answer to that is Namdik Sufa. Because man has self-awareness. And when he sees God as outside of him. And what he says when he refers to God, me, you. So mankind sees God as separate and outside of him. And therefore he assumes that just as he sees God as outside of him, God sees himself as outside of man. So therefore, there's a duality. Self-awareness gives man the ability to see a duality. Me and you. But what God says to him, that's not true. That is a fallacy. Because there's no such thing as me, you. I am not a you. I am not outside of you. Where am I? I'm inside of you. I am your foundation. I am the foundation of the way you know yourself. I am the foundation of your self-awareness. And that's what you are. And God says to man, I want you to choose that. I want you to choose that because fundamentally you are born with a dichotomy, two possibilities. That's man. Mankind is the only being that's created with what's called a possibility. There is no other creature that has this concept. Every creature that was created by God does not have two possibilities. He is what he is. He only has one possibility. Every animal has no free will. Every plant has no free will. Every object, inanimate object, has no free will. That means it is what it is, what it is. It doesn't have a confusion about what it is. A lion has no confusion of what it means to be a lion. He is a lion, and he knows exactly what that means. A plant has no confusion about being a plant. His awareness of himself, the plant, is that he's a plant, and that's it. Man is the only thing that has a true sense of self. And as a sense of self, he therefore has a confusion because there's two possibilities. Either God is outside of him or God is inside of him. Either he sees God as a me, you type of entity, or he sees God as an inner me entity. So man is confused because he has an error that he makes. His self-awareness gives him an error, a mistake, where he suddenly sees God as outside. And he says, could this be true? Well, if he does mitzvahs and he declares his unity to God, that he comes from God. So he declares that God is not outside of him. God is inside of him. But man is the only thing which is created which has this choice, either to make a mistake in terms of his relationship with God, or not to make a mistake where he understands his actual relationship with God. But man, therefore, is called a possibility. Everything that is created by God is not a possibility, it's a certainty. A lion is a lion. A plant is a plant. A table is a table. A star is a star. A planet is a planet. It's not a possibility of what you are through your self-awareness. You are what you are, and that's it. But with man, because he has his own sense of self-awareness, he's confused about his relationship with God. Man, therefore, is created from the outset as a possibility between two choices. And God says, you have to make the correct choice. So automatically, therefore, man is not created with a direct way. Man is flexible. Man is possible. And therefore, when he decides who he is, either God is a you or God is not a you. That determines his mind, his sense of self, or the sense of itself becomes exactly what he has decided. And in making that decision, he actually creates his sense of self in a certain direction. So man is the only being that's a possibility of two choices. Choice one, where God is a you. Choice two, where God is not a you. And God says you have to make that choice from your free will, from nothing outside of you. So therefore, that choice becomes your reality. Mankind creates from himself from a possibility to a certainty of a reality. So that's what it is. Free will comes from the confusion of what a person is, that man finds himself in an ambivalent way. He doesn't know exactly who he is in relationship to God. And that's therefore man is created as a possibility. So when he makes that choice and decides that what? That God is his foundation and that God is part of him, when he makes that choice, so that's suddenly that decision that he makes from himself, from the itself of what he is, from a non-outside place, he becomes that. He becomes his decision in terms of what he is. So he changes his nature from a possibility to a certainty by his choice. And that choice comes from him and him alone. It does not come from the outside. In regard to the choice of free will, it comes from the inside of man. So therefore, that means his choice is from himself totally, with no outside. And in that sense, he's similar to God. So therefore, Olam Haba, what is Olam Haba? Olam Haba, which is the future world, is the world, fundamentally, that man creates. There is no Olam Haba now. When the Gemara says, Ayin Loy or no eye has seen it, it means there is no future world now. It doesn't exist. Why? Because man has not finished making the choice. So therefore, Olam Haba has not been created yet. It will be created when man makes the final choice, either one way or the other. Either God is a you, or God is not a you. God is inside me. And only when he makes that decision does he actually become that decision, and he derives his satisfaction from that which he created. So when man does a mitzvah, that's the only time man is acting like God. Why? Because that's the only time that suddenly he's making a choice from the inside of himself, not from the outside. And he is therefore creating something which never existed before, because he was created as a possibility. And when he makes himself the certainty of a choice one way or the other, he now becomes real either one way or the other. This never existed before. So Olam Haba starts from the beginning. It starts from himself and it ends with himself. And that fundamentally is what man is. God created him, made him like him himself, and wanted him to achieve this certainty with this satisfaction that he created himself. Olam Haba is the situation where man creates himself. He creates his own being. And there's nothing in the world that can exist like man. There's nothing as divine as man. So because God wanted to give man a satisfaction which is similar to his, God wanted to give man a satisfaction, a joy, which is similar to his, which comes from the creation of himself. Nothing else was involved in that creation. What's involved in that creation is the choice that the man has of himself. And this comes from nowhere and from nothing. So in that sense, Olam Haba is like the world where God is. Whatever world that is. God is in a world, not which he possesses or in a world. God is the world. God's being is the world itself. So therefore, man's being is himself. And this is very difficult to understand. Man creates himself by his free will, which comes from nowhere but himself. And in that sense, he creates himself. So therefore, man is Olam Haba. The satisfaction that a human being possesses in his choice, in his relationship to God, is himself. It was created not from an outside. It was created from an inside. It is him. So we have to understand what Olam Haba is. And that is the power of man. You have to understand the true godless, the true greatness of a human being. That a human being participates in a somewhat divine activity of making a choice, creating a certainty from a possibility that does not come from anything outside of him. And that's called free will. So in a certain sense, Olam Haba is the closest that man gets to, the closest that man gets to being God is called Olam Haba. Because in Olam Haba is the product of a divinity. That's right. Olam Haba is nothing more than the product of a divinity, a choice that does not come from an outside. It comes from your free will. And that's similar to God. It does not, his joy of himself does not come from anything outside of him. It is him. And that's the same thing which happens to man. The joy that man has, or the tov that God wants to give him, comes from where? It comes from his choice itself. It comes from his inner being, not from an outside. And in that sense, he resembles God like no other being in creation. So I've given a completely different understanding of what Olam Haba is.
Yeah.
And
okay.
It's somewhat different. So I want you to understand what I'm saying here. Something completely different and something which is very hard to understand. So when God tells you that through your mitzvahs, which are done by free will, you will create yourself, and yourself will become your world. You will become your world. And that's the essence of it. And that's what it means, Tselem Elokim. What is it, Tselem Elokim? Tselem Elokim is the image of God. And in the sense that you create yourself and your situation and your reality, not from the outside, but from the inside, that is a divine result, a divine action. And this is what I have in store for you. That you will replicate to some extent my experience of myself. And you will replicate that on some level for yourself. Okay. So are there any questions? I would advise you.
It sounds like a great reduction here. Like
what's that?
There's a lot of reduction going on. It sounds like we've gotten rid of the concept of a gavul, and gotten rid of the concept of Olam Haba as a separate thing from us.
Right. Right. And I've gotten rid of earning something. You don't earn anything. You create something. Earning is not the word. You create something. And it's not even something that you create your ownership of something. It is you. Your Olam Haba is you. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you understand this. And it's good to review this. And when you review it, you can get a deep understanding of what I'm trying to say. Okay.
For sure.
Thank you for listening.